The theory of communism wants to create a utopian society. But has that ever been accomplished in nations that have had communist revolutions? You decide. While China, Cuba, Vietnam, and North Korea have all had communist revolutions, we're going to take a look at the USSR. In 1917, Lenin led a revolution with the motto peace, land, and bread. The revolutionaries overthrew the Tsar, then eventually they take over the government to set up a Bolshevik government. Lenin starts to implement his promises by getting Russia out of World War I, peace, and redistributing property so that everyone had a place to live. That included taking larger than average homes and turning them into apartment buildings without permission of the homeowners. Not everybody in Russia wanted to be a communist, so a civil war pulled Lenin away from accomplishing his communist goals. He had to institute war communism, where food surpluses were sent to the army to help them win the war. Eventually, Lenin sees that he can't create a pure communist society and establishes the NEP, the New Economic Policy. This allowed small-scale private enterprise in areas like agriculture. So, for example, a farmer could keep any surplus grain he grew and sell it for his own profit, which is an individualist idea. This took the communist USSR from the very left of the economic spectrum, just a tad to the right. Was Marx rolling in his grave? After Lenin dies, Stalin eventually gains power over the USSR and cancels the NEP in favor of a purely Marxist society. Stalin created 5-year plans to organize the economy. The government agency Gosplan would work with other government agencies to determine what goods were needed to be produced and how to organize the supply of resources to produce those goods. This is different from Sweden's 5-year indicative planning, because Stalin's government didn't just indicate where the economy would go, he demanded it. Producers were given quotas they were expected to meet, otherwise they might be sent to a gulag. These 5-year plans focused on industrialization, which was important to Stalin because the USSR was far behind the rest of Europe in terms of industrial strength, and Stalin knew that left his nation at risk of another invasion so soon after World War I. Stalin was able to justify the rejection of classical liberalism in favor of communism by pointing to his results. His nation industrialized in a tenth of the time it took many European nations to industrialize. By controlling the economy instead of leaving it to the private market forces of supply and demand, Stalin created a nation powerful enough to become a superpower in his lifetime. But that power came at a high price. It was very difficult to organize an economy where you literally needed to know what resources you had to have 5 years in advance. Gosplan, the planning agency, had to take into account all of the items required to create a product and couldn't predict things like natural disasters or what would be in demand years from now. Therefore, resources were wasted, and even worse, workers were often subject to harsh working conditions. Peasants were forced off the land as farms were collectivized and turned into state-owned industries, and a rebellion in the Ukrainian wheat belt led to a famine that many consider to be a genocide. The government employed spies and encouraged people to rat on each other in order to maintain control, and the threat of imprisonment was always lurking. This wasn't the society that Marx had envisioned, but Stalin told the people this hardship was just a temporary step on their way to creating a socialist paradise. Another problem that came with the Soviet Union's focus on industrialization meant that the government planners ignored consumer goods, which can often spur economic growth. Think about it. Once you have a tractor, you're not buying a new model next year because it comes in a new color. But you just might do that with a cell phone. A black market flourished as consumers scrambled to get what they wanted, not what the government told them they needed. But of course, quotas must be met. Managers would find various ways to cheat the quotas in order to avoid work, but also avoid the gulag. There's a story of a truck factory needing to supply a quota of trucks based on weight instead of numbers. So the factory manager increased the weight of the trucks in order to meet their quota. Over the decades, the Soviet economy stagnated. We pretend to work, and they pretend to pay us, was the lament amongst the people who were not happy with the limited standard of living that came with public control. Something had to change, and that change was Gorbachev. Like Lenin and his NEP, Gorbachev saw the need to introduce a few aspects of capitalism into the communist economy in order to make communism more successful. Kind of seems like an oxymoron. He allowed people to own their own small businesses, let farmers keep surplus crops to sell for a profit, and encouraged a greater emphasis on consumer goods. The small-scale enterprises started to flourish, demonstrating to the people the advantages of market economic forces. Gorbachev also demanded that all large-scale enterprises be responsible for their own financing and not depend on the government to bail them out when things went wrong. These changes are known as perestroika. Gorbachev also introduced glasnost, or greater openness. For example, he encouraged plant managers to have more input on what was going on in their factories. So what was the result of glasnost and perestroika? Well, probably not what Gorbachev intended, since these reforms were supposed to improve a communist society. Instead, it opened the floodgates to revolution, and within a few years, the USSR collapses and becomes a more liberal society. Yeltsin becomes the first elected president, and he decides to make a rapid changeover to capitalism. Rip it off like a Band-Aid. This massive turn to right-wing economics led to almost economic collapse. Basically, Russia now got to experience the Great Depression, with its high unemployment and crime. The value of the ruble plummeted as trading nations didn't trust this new society, with all of the corruption and lack of infrastructure. Friends and relatives of communist officials bought the privatized state industries at a fraction of their value and became rich overnight. We call them the oligarchs. But things did get better. Just like how we got through our Great Depression, Russia's economy is growing. They've set up good banking systems that encourage people to invest, the middle class is growing, and Russia participates in international organizations like the WTO. And their wealth of oil promises to keep their economy strong, as long as oil prices stay high. I once heard a great analogy to explain these two economic systems. It's like parenting. Parents who are really strict provide their children with a safe environment, but limited opportunities to grow and explore. Communism. Yet lenient parents give their children so much freedom there can be a danger if the child makes a major mistake, like capitalism. So what kind of an economic parent would you be?